Sunday, April 30, 2023. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we take a deep dive into the news of the week. You can support my work and get exclusive access to bonus content at patreon.com/5minutenews. Our guest today worked as a federal and state prosecutor for 14 years, trying cases involving violent crime, human trafficking, public corruption and organized crime, including 8 years as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. He is author of 2 books, Hatchet Man, How Bill Barr Broke the Prosecutor's Code and Corrupted the Justice Department, and most recently, Untouchable, How Powerful People Get Away with It. Elie Honig, welcome to The Weekend Show.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to discussing with you, Anthony.
I find your books very interesting. I have a lot of interest in Bill Barr, the guy who ran away just a few days before the insurrection out the back door. So we're going to talk about him a little bit later. But first, obviously, multiple districts as well as the special prosecutor are finally making headway with Donald Trump's multiple crimes. And as with Nixon, it might end up being the cover-up rather than the crime itself that ends up being his downfall. Which of the current cases do you think has got the most chance of being victorious, first of all?
Yeah, I'm glad you phrased it that way because there's a lot of different ways you can look at this. I used to always get which one's going to be charged first. We now know the answer to that, of course, the Manhattan DA. But I think that of the, let's put it at 4 contenders. We've got the Manhattan DA hush money case, which has been charged. We've got the Georgia Fulton County DA's investigation of Trump's attempt to steal the election in Georgia. And then we've got the 2 federal DOJ special counsel investigations, one of them into January 6th and one of them into the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. Like I said, we now have the answer to which one will hit first, but I also think that that's the weakest case, both in terms of the conduct, and I'm talking about the hush money case here, or the hush money cover-up case, as you said. I think the conduct is the weakest of the 4, and I think the evidence is middling. It's not overwhelmingly strong. It's vulnerable, but it's also not an impossible case to make. I think the case I'd be most worried about would be either of the DOJ cases, simply because DOJ has so much more firepower. They have so much more resources and expertise. And this is a little bit getting into the nuances here. DOJ is not going to have a constitutional problem with charging the president, whereas county and state level DAs might run into a legal problem that might prevent them from ever getting to a jury. So I think all in all, I'd be most afraid if I was Donald Trump of DOJ. But you said a really important word, Anthony. You said the word finally. And one of the things that I've been critical of in my book and continued to be correct on is the inexcusably slow pace of all of these prosecutors, all of whom have allowed multiple years to lapse before taking action. And now we're in this situation where if there are more, we already know there's one set of charges. If there are more charges, we have this very difficult question about when do they get tried? Are we really going to have trials of a guy who's likely to be the Republican nominee in the middle of the 2024 campaign? I have serious questions about that.
Do you think Americans realize that this is kind of crazy? You know, the fact that a guy can commit, treason against his own country. The actual president, I mean, it's not even like, the vice president or somebody in a back office. Like this is the actual president. It's all on video. It's all on tape. All the evidence is clear. Anybody with a modicum of common sense who is not too politically skewed on one side or the other can see that this is really very cut and dry. And yet, as you described, the system is so slow that we are now over 2 years out from the insurrection, and still he is parading himself around Mar-a-Lago and goodness knows where else as if he is the next president of the United States.
I do think it's easy to go numb to all of this. I do think it's easy to get used to it when all of this is so beyond whatever would have been considered ordinary or even extraordinary before this. I mean, if we think about some of the worst scandals and abuses of prior U.S. presidents, from Nixon to Clinton to, in some respects, George W. Bush, all of them pale in comparison to not just the number, but the scale of what we're looking at from Donald Trump. And I think this is really what led me to write the second book, because people ask me all the time, how could this be? How could he have gotten away with it all? I mean, he has been sued many times. He has been subpoenaed. He has been deposed. He has been impeached twice. He has had criminal referrals made against him. Now he's facing his first set of actual criminal charges. But here we are in 2023, the middle of 2023. He's not been convicted of anything. I don't think it's I think there's a chance, but it's not particularly likely that he gets convicted before the 2024 election of anything. And if he does, it won't be final because it's still got to go through all the levels of appeal. There's no way that gets done before the 2024 election. And I think as to the ultimate prospect of will he go to prison, I think it remains very unlikely. And more so as each day passes. And yes, now here we're in the situation where Donald Trump is really not just emerging, but pulling away from the field, it seems, as the likely Republican nominee. For a while, it looked like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, would mount a serious challenge, but Trump has just been knocking the heck out of him for the last several weeks, and he's taking a real dive at the polls. So, yes, we are going to have this almost unfathomable situation where we're going to have probably one of the two major parties' nominees campaigning for president in what promises to be a close election while he's under one or more criminal indictments.
As with the title of your latest book, Untouchable, why is the US such a safe haven for rich, white, older men to do whatever they want and get away with it? Because young black men just get sent straight to prison or they get executed in the street without a trial. I mean, there is quite a difference here, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Of course, I do take issue a bit. I get that you're being rhetorical here, but I mean,
well, I'm not really being rhetorical.
Well,
I mean,
you're not just plucked up off the street and sent to prison. I mean, people have their due process rights, and they either go to trial or plead guilty.
Yeah, but it is skewed, and the evidence does suggest that there is a skew against young black men, especially.
For sure, and I think that's notable and worth noting. It's certainly not absolute. In the book, what I did in the book is I sort of combined my current work in the media with some original reporting that I did about what happened behind the scenes in one of the Trump cases where the feds actually had the hush money case against Trump and decided not to bring it. Now, the state prosecutor across the street has brought it, but I combined that reporting with my own experience, 14 years as a prosecutor. And the main thing that I prosecuted when I was with the federal prosecutor's office was organized crime, Mafia, Italian organized crime, like you would see in Goodfellas or Sopranos, but real, and in some ways more sensational. And as I tell a lot of stories in the book about my days prosecuting mafia bosses and the tactics they would use. And I kept on seeing these parallels. And it's become trendy, I guess, in some quarters to say, well, Trump's like a mob boss. Trump's like a mob boss. I make the case in this book that he really is, and I give very specific examples. So what goes into it? It's really a combination of factors. There's money. There are laws that favor powerful people. There are DOJ practices, prosecutorial practices that favor wealthy, powerful people. And I'm not afraid to call out my fellow prosecutors, past and present, in this book. And there are all sorts of built-in systemic advantages. Now, that's not to say that every powerful person gets away with it. There's plenty of powerful people who end up in jail. But as I highlight in the book, a lot of times that happens only after prosecutors or cops have already botched a case. And then there's a media uproar about it, as we saw with people like Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Cosby, and maybe to an extent Donald Trump as well. So there are all sorts of built-in advantages, and savvy tacticians, and I do include Donald Trump in that, know where the lines are and know where to stop and know how to insulate themselves.
The Mafia thing I've talked about before, and I find this really interesting because I think he thinks he's Mafia.
Yeah.
And he talks about Al Capone, like Al Capone is someone to look up to. And the relationships with people like Giuliani, who's turned out to be a bit of a mafia guy himself, and I always point to the signet ring, I always think that's a bit of bit of a sign. But it's just this attitude of we can run this city, Manhattan, we can pay people off, we can silence people, we have backdoor dealings, relationships with senior people to make things happen and make things go away. I mean, all of that is mafia rhetoric, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so much of what Trump, first of all, a lot of his rhetoric, you hit the nail on the head, is reminiscent of mob bosses. One thing that mob bosses are really good at doing is making their wishes known, giving orders and instructions without quite saying it explicitly. I have a whole chapter on this. And I give examples. I give an example. I actually opened the book with a story of a case we did against a very powerful Gambino family mobster in New York City, where the entirety of our evidence against that person that he authorized a murder was that when he was told the victim was someone they suspected of being an informant for the police, he said, do what you have to do. That's it. And now that's not a great case, right? Because Defense lawyer can say, do what you have to do. That can mean anything. That can mean beat the guy up. That can mean go talk to him. That can mean confirm it and come back to me. But we had to make our case based on what we had. And everyone in the Mafia knew, all of our witnesses said, of course, what that means is kill him in this scenario. Trump, of course, I'm not saying Trump's ever ordered a murder or a violent attack, but there are all sorts of examples of Trump conveying his wishes to his people without quite saying it. I mean, perfect example is January 6th. Be there, will be wild, right? You have to march down to the Capitol and show strength. He never said, I want you to go in there and break windows and storm the Capitol per se. But did his followers understand that? You bet. And you know that, A, because we saw what they did, but B, because a lot of the people who stormed the Capitol have now been prosecuted. And in their court cases, they're arguing, well, Your Honor, my client did storm the Capitol. He regrets what he did, but he did it because he understood and believed that Donald Trump, who he supports politically, was asking him to do that. And we've seen many of those defendants say that. So that's one example. I'll give you another example from the book of a sort of common, but I think less understood mafia tactic. I think everyone understands that wealthy people can pay for powerful, rich, intimidating lawyers. I have some chapters on that. One thing that's lesser understood, though, whenever we would do a large mafia case with 15, 20 defendants, we would realize very quickly that the boss was choosing and paying for all the lawyers, not just his own, but everyone around him. And the reason for that, fairly obvious, I think, but it becomes really hard to cooperate, right? Because you have to get away from this lawyer who's really there to protect the boss. Now, there are ways around it. I tell a story in the book of a sort of cloak and dagger way that we managed to get around that in a mafia case. But Trump and his organizations do the exact same thing. They pay for lawyers, for witnesses. And we saw a great example this past summer when Cassidy Hutchinson, the former White House aide, testified in front of the January 6th committee and gave remarkable testimony. Well, it turns out she wasn't able and willing to come forward while she was represented by a lawyer who had been selected and paid for by Trump-affiliated groups. Only when she broke away from that lawyer did she feel comfortable and confident and safe coming forward and telling the full truth. So that's another tactic that I think people may not recognize, but it's very common in the criminal world, in the mob world, and in Trump world.
So with your experience with mob bosses, do they know that they're breaking the law? Like, do they feel?
Yes.
Do they enjoy like breaking the law? Is that like part of the game for them? Because the way that Trump talks about being, they saying all this stuff. It's a witch hunt. It's a hoax. Like deny, and he's very clever with his language. He purposely tries with certain things to communicate on multiple levels and not leave a paper trail, whether because he's eating the documents and flushing them down the toilet, I don't know. But, he, like you say with January 6th, he incites in a way, stand back and stand by. All of this language is just on the periphery of landing himself in hot water. And that is a kind of mafia move as far as I'm aware, if you're a Sopranos fan. So does he know that he's breaking the law and just getting away with it, or does he just think that everyone's against him and he can do no wrong?
It's a great question. So I think to take the first part of your question, do mafia bosses know they're breaking the law? For sure. Do they enjoy it? They enjoy the power that comes with it and the results of it. But actually, in my experience, I've dealt with a lot of these guys. Some of them have cooperated. I think the mafia guys more see it as just a workaday job and what they do. Does Trump know he's breaking the law? I'm sure he does in his heart of hearts. But I think if I had to sort of psychoanalyze him from a distance, I think he doesn't care. I think he just feels like genuinely the rules don't and shouldn't apply to him. And I think he believes that anyone who's coming after him is doing so for political purposes. He certainly says that. And I think his whole attitude is, I do what I do. I'm special. I'm sort of the chosen one. And nobody's ever really stuck me with anything other than a financial bill as of yet. And I think in his mind, I don't think he remotely considers it a possibility that he will end up in prison. And as I argue in the book, he might be right.
I think you're right too. And I think if anything, he'll end up under house arrest in Mar-a-Lago, which will suit him very well.
Because, I don't think he would mind that much,
Yeah. Let's just talk about mental health for a second. It's something that people don't really like to talk about. In fact, my guest last week, Dr. Bandy Lee, who was one of the many psychiatrists who basically said that Trump has this malignant narcissism, and she now talks about Trump contagion phenomenon, where the followers and the supporters are also now mentally ill, and that she's been silenced by the media pretty much. She can't get on television and talk about this stuff. And yet there is consensus from thousands of psychiatrists. You don't need to sit with Trump in a room to diagnose him because he's the most photographed man on the planet. At what point does mental health become a problem for a prosecutor? Because Trump is nuts, and yet he has been legitimized by the media. He's been legitimized even by the other politicians by, instead of saying he's nuts and seriously referencing the psychological evaluations that have been done, they just listen to what he has to say and take it as gospel. I mean, he lives outside of reality, and we play by the rules of the system, and that is reality for 99% of the population.
Yeah.
My personal feeling is that he really was never well enough to be president in the first place.
So I couldn't even begin to give any sort of obviously clinical,
Sure.
I think I took one semester of psychology in college. So I'm not going to get into that game. When would a person's mental health become an issue for prosecutors? We're nowhere near that for Donald Trump, because what you have to show in order for we hear about the insanity defense, which is a little bit of an overgeneralized and overused phrase. But in order for it to become an issue in a criminal case, the defense would have to show that the person just didn't even understand the very nature of what they were doing, didn't understand the actions they were taking, really even just the difference between, not even right or wrong, broader than that. So I don't think we're at the phase where anybody could make some sort of insanity defense. But I do think it is interesting to sort of see the way, I do agree that Donald Trump has influenced certainly the way his followers look at the world. And also, by the way, the methods that some of his pursuers have used to go after him. And I actually argue in the book that I'm not okay with, and I'm critical of certain prosecutors who I think have bent the rules and have bent their ordinary practices because they're so hell-bent on getting him. And you earlier raised the example of Al Capone. I actually use that example in the book. I say, you'll hear people say something about Trump like, someone's got to nail this guy for something somehow. I don't care what for, and I don't care how. And they use Al Capone. They go, well, Al Capone did all these crimes, but they got him on his taxes. So let's do the same thing with Trump. I completely reject that. I do not think it's okay to say, here's this one person who, for whatever reason, bothers the heck out of us, is dangerous, is whatever you want to say. And so we're going to probe and probe and probe and probe. And whatever we can find, whether it's taxes or something from the distant past, as long as we put them away, the ends justify the means. I reject that. And I think it's important that we keep our principles and our rules and our practices in order. And frankly, we have seen people compromise that. And I give some examples in the book. Now, that's the secondary problem. The primary problem is Trump's own lies and denial of reality and the sort of angry rhetoric and worse, sometimes violent actions that it can spawn. I don't think they're necessarily equal. It's not a both sides are kind of thing. But I do think it's worth keeping in mind both of those phenomena.
It's so hard, isn't it? Because mental health is an unknown quantity and no one wants to go there. And yet, we're trying to be more awake, aren't we? Yeah. We're all trying to understand more about ourselves. And often it's the people that need it most, the ones that are not in therapy and are not getting the help that they need. But it's just very interesting when it comes to legal matters. And certainly in the US, I recognize that for all of these different cases and all of these different prosecutors and everybody that's kind of looking to do the right thing, because this is not a partisan issue. I mean, this is the thing that people who are Trump supporters don't understand. This is about, you protect the United States first. And Trump has become this he has become the Republican Party, and the Republican Party has become Trump. How dangerous is that going forward? Because to all intents and purposes, if there's no Trump, there's no Republican Party, and so they're not going to allow him to go down.
It's been remarkable, really, even over just the last few months, to see what's happening on the Republican primary side in a political sense, because there was a lot of question of, A, will Trump run again? B, if he does, will he face serious opposition in the Republican Party? And C, will these indictments or the looming threat of these indictments derail him? And the answer is yes, he will run. Number two, no, he does not look like he will be seriously challenged at this point. I mean, I think the one sort of front runner that in most people's minds was Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, but boy, is he getting his butt kicked lately by Trump, and Trump is widening his lead in the polls. And I don't see a viable political contender to emerge against him on the Republican side. And then see how the indictments play. The first indictment that dropped, the Manhattan DA's case involving the hush money payments, has, if anything, bolstered Trump's support, both financially and in terms of the polling with Republicans. Now, right, what does it do? And I think there's a separate question here about, but what will happen if and when the more serious cases land, the election interference cases, perhaps the classified document cases? Will that change the calculus a little bit? I was, maybe I'm naive. I thought that the American populace would, as a whole, say, even if we like this guy, even if he's our preferred guy, when he has 2 or 3 or however many, 1 to 4 indictments hanging over him, let's not put him in the Oval Office, because who knows what kind of situation that's going to be. But look, I think it's unfortunate, but also the prosecutors collectively fault that they all took so darn long that Alvin Bragg, and I should say Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, is a friend of mine and a former colleague of mine, that Alvin Bragg came first with the weakest case. And now I think you're in almost like a boy who cried wolf scenario where whatever the next case is, it looks like it's probably going to be Georgia on election interference, Trump and his supporters, you know what they're going to say. You know what they're going to say. They're going to go, here we go again. The first one was piddly and ancient and borderline misdemeanor, maybe a felony. And it looks like it's maybe politically motivated. They'll say it's politically motivated. Well, here comes the next local elected partisan Democrat DA who's doing the same thing. Everyone's just piling, at a certain point, I think they're hoping that people see this as just a prosecutorial pile-on. I don't think that's accurate, but the way prosecutors have handled this has played right into his hands.
Let's talk about Alvin Bragg for a minute, because, as you say, he was first out of the gate. And a lot of us who want Trump to, be removed from society for the sake of society, we put a lot of trust in Alvin Bragg because, there was like 34 counts. And so we thought that they was going to get him on like multiple stuff. And then when it starts to come out, you realize, is this enough? And then you start to hear Trump's defense, which you hear on Truth Social. You don't really hear it from his lawyers. That I never hear them say he's innocent. I just hear this kind of distraction, technique. And Trump's specific lawyer looks like a mob boss himself. He's straight out of Central Casting. I don't know where he found that guy from. So how does Alvin Bragg kind of close this deal, considering that he's up against this kind of will-o'-the-wisp character who can try and critique the individual? He's gone after Bragg as an individual on a personal level. He's gone after Bragg's family. He's really trying to he's dancing with the devil, isn't he?
So let me talk first of all about 2 of the principles that you just mentioned. Joe Tacopina, Trump's lawyer. I'm going to take issue with your description of Joe. I don't think that's fair. He's a loud guy. He talks like a lot of people here in New Jersey and New York.
Yeah, he's got the New Jersey vibe for sure.
Right, he does. I will cop to that. But I used to have cases against Joe. He's an experienced defense lawyer who knows what he's doing. Also, it's not the time of the process when you would fully articulate your defense. All we've seen is an indictment that I think is faulty in some ways, which we'll talk about. And the defendant doesn't have to prove his innocence. That's not the way our system works. The prosecution bears the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So let me start with that. Alvin Bragg, like I said, former colleague of mine, we were together at the federal prosecutor's office. I think very highly of Alvin. He's an accomplished, careful, thoughtful individual. And he got himself into political hot water with Democrats because about a year ago, he refused to charge a different Trump financial case. This guy, Mark Pomerantz, who I'm a big critic of, I don't know him, but I'm very critical of him, had come on to work with Alvin Bragg's predecessor. And Pomerantz in some ways embodies for me what I mean by people who are obsessed with Trump, because Pomerantz came out of retirement, worked for free, has since said he would have paid for the chance to prosecute Trump, and just dug into anything he could find, as old as he could find, every piece of paper in the Trump org. Now, would Mark Pomerantz have done that if not for political purposes, if not for personal motivation? I don't think so. And that's not the way prosecutors should work. Anyway, Alvin Bragg takes over as DA. Mark Pomerantz brings him this other financial case. And Alvin, to his credit, looks at it and says, this is not ready. You don't have the evidence. Keep working. And what does Pomerantz do? Instead of doing the work, he quits and he goes public. His very haughty resignation letter somehow leaks to the New York Times very quickly. He does a book tour, goes on 60 Minutes, he goes on Maddow. And it turns out a lot of what Pomerantz said is just BS. Pomerantz tried to argue that his case was ready to go and Alvin killed it. Turns out Pomerantz didn't even draft a prosecution memo, didn't even draft a draft indictment, didn't even know what specific state law he wanted to charge. That's like me walking into a bank and asking for $1 million loan and them asking me for documents and me saying, I don't have documents on me, but just, I'm good. Just give it to me. You would never do that. So Alvin took a lot of heat from that in Democratic and liberal circles. And remember, Manhattan, where he's elected, is overwhelmingly blue, Democratic, liberal. And I think that's to Alvin's credit now when we're assessing his decision to charge this case, because he said no before, and now he feels like this case is ready to go. There are real questions about this hush money case, though. First of all, like I said, the feds, DOJ, Alvin and my both former office, passed on charging Donald Trump. They could have. They met on it when Trump left office. I report this in the book, and they decided not to. I argue in the book they should have charged it, that Trump did commit a federal crime. The other thing is this is an awkward fit for state laws. The campaign finance, the crime here is not paying hush money. It's important to understand that. The crime is falsifying business records relating to that payment. And the theory is they falsely log those payments as legal fees. But that's only a misdemeanor. That's a piddling little crime under New York state law. No one will go to prison for a misdemeanor. In order to make it a felony, the lowest level felony, but a felony, they have to prove that he falsified those records in connection with some other crime. And they've argued, this is where I am critical of the indictment. The indictment doesn't tell us what those other crimes are. And the point of an indictment is to give notice to the defendant. It may be a campaign finance theory, but I don't think that's going to float legally because this is a state court and we're talking about a federal election for president. There's also been some allusion to tax fraud, but they've never even begun. Prosecutors have not even begun to explain what they mean by that or how there was any tax loss. So I do give Bragg credit for apparently sticking to his guns and being careful in which cases he is and is not bringing. I'm just not sure that this case is ultimately going to hold up. And even if it does, even if Trump gets convicted on all 34 counts, I think he's unlikely, given what I know about New York practice, to be sentenced to prison time.
And Republican media, they are presenting this as an administrative error, right? They are downplaying it in such a way to try and garner support from his base so that they understand that this was not anything criminal. This was just administration. Yeah. And then, of course, you've got, the Alan Weisselberg side of this as well, where it looks like he's taken the fall for a lot of the kind of Trump organization stuff. And so people might think, oh, well, this was already dealt with, when, of course, that was a different issue.
Yeah, so it's not an error. If it was an error, there would not be a crime here, right? The theory that the prosecutors have alleged is that this was intentionally falsified. Now, the trick is going to be tying Donald John Trump to not the hush money payments, but to the falsification of that. We know Michael Cohen was involved in falsifying them as legal fees because he's pled guilty to that. He's the one who invoiced the case as legal fees. So they're going to have to tie Donald Trump to the actual way that those payments were booked. So we'll sort of start with that. This is not going to be an easy case. It's going to turn largely on Michael Cohen's testimony, but you make another good point that I make in the book. There are always fall guys. Good bosses, smart bosses know how to insulate themselves. Who did Donald Trump have do his dirty work, structure these payments? His lawyer, Michael Cohen, his CFO, Alan Weisselberg, both of whom have now gone to jail. Now people say sometimes, well, that can't be. How can the underling go to jail but not the boss? And my answer is that happens sometimes in our system. And I talk about that in the book. I'm not saying it's good. I write about it because I don't think it's good. But sometimes the reality is you just don't have the proof on the boss. I talk about drug cases I did where we would intercept enormous shipments. I talk about one case with 200 kilos. And obviously that's coming from, 200 kilos is worth $5 million of cocaine. And we were able to flip one guy and get up one level, but we couldn't flip anyone else. And we knew this cocaine was the property of someone way higher, but we just couldn't get there. So sometimes that's the way it works out. And the other thing is you have these people around you to do your dirty work. And if they flip, as Michael Cohen has tried to flip, there's a built-in attack on them, which is this guy's a criminal. He has bad motives. He hates me personally. And his incentive now is to implicate someone else to get a sentencing break. And so I sort of talk about that dynamic in the book and the way that prosecutors do and do not deal with that effectively.
This kind of reminds me of the Warren Buffett rule, where he said that why does his secretary pay more tax than he does? And, he wanted to try and right that wrong.
Right.
And here we have Alan Weisselberg, who, took the fall for a lot of this. And he only got, a 4-month sentence and was out in 2 months.
Right.
I mean, this by comparison, this was a huge crime, and yet again, the kind of old white rich man gets away with it, whether he's the fall guy or not. I mean, that was not really a punishment.
Weisselberg's short punishment is due to a couple factors. One, the New York state law on this kind of fraud for a first-time offender is just not that tough. Two, the DA's office tried to flip Weisselberg. He didn't flip, and then I fault the DA's office. They really gave him an out. They let him, what I would call half-assed cooperate. The way it works in the federal system, the way I was always trained is if you're going to cooperate, it's all or nothing. You have to tell us, we used to say to cooperators, mob guys, tell us every single thing you've ever done. Start when you were 14 and you stole a pack of cigarettes from the corner store and move on through. And you have to do that because in order to present these witnesses credibly to a jury, you have to be able to say to a jury, he's an open book. He's told you about everything he's done. He's pled guilty to everything he's ever done. And then they have to testify against every single person who they've ever known to commit crimes. What the DA's office did with Weisselberg was really they gave him a way out. They let him, quote unquote, cooperate. And they said, well, you're going to have to testify against the Trump org, but not any individual. And so Weisselberg, they let him off the hook. They let him get this big sentencing break. And he testifies against the Trump org, which was convicted. But who cares? It's a corporate conviction, meaning they get hit with a financial penalty. No one goes to jail for a corporate conviction. And Weisselberg gets sort of the best of both worlds. He doesn't have to turn on any individual, including Donald Trump, yet he still gets a sentencing break. I wrote an article calling that prosecutorial malpractice.
The sad thing about this is so many regular people live in fear of the IRS. They live in fear of the local police service. Mm-hmm. And, they try and do right by society and by the law because they fear going to jail or they fear whatever. And these people just don't. They will keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And it really is one rule for one and a completely different set of rules for another.
Well, there comes a point, I think, again, where if you've done it long enough a certain way, gotten away with it long enough for a certain way, beaten back so many investigations, lawsuits, threats, impeachments, what have you, I do think, to incorporate the title of my book, I do think people start to think they're untouchable and that nothing will ever happen to them. And it's not just Trump. I mean, I write in the book about Harvey Weinstein, the notorious film producer, about Jeffrey Epstein, about Bill Cosby. I think they all certainly knew darn well what they were doing and knew that it was very straightforward criminal, and often violent criminal in terms of sexual assaults. And they just thought, no one will ever catch me. No one will ever turn me in. And if they do, the cops won't believe them. And if they do, a jury won't believe them. And they were right until, in all three of the people I just mentioned, Weinstein, Epstein, and Cosby, they were right until the media really focused attention on these people. And a lot of it's due to great reporting. And when the media focused on these folks and started finding more victims, the uproar got to a point where prosecutors really just yielded to pressure and finally, belatedly and often incompletely, did the right thing.
We need to take a quick break for our sponsor message, but I want to come back and talk about William Barr,
sure.
Everybody's favorite former Attorney General, in just a moment here on The Weekend Show. Everyone knows how annoying cheap razors are. The cuts, the irritation, the frustration. And don't get me started with subscription razor services, the headaches those can cause. That's why you've got to meet Henson Shaving. Henson Shaving is a family-owned aerospace parts manufacturer that has made parts for the ISS, the International Space Station, and Mars rover. And now they're bringing precision engineering to your shaving experience. Razor blades are like diving boards. The longer the board, the more the wobble. The more the wobble, the more the nicks, cuts, and scrapes. A bad shave isn't a blade problem, it's an extension problem. By using aerospace-grade CNC machines, Henson makes metal razors that extend just 0.0013 inches, which is less than the thickness of a human hair. That means a secure and stable blade with a vibration-free shave. It gets better. The razor has built-in channels to evacuate hair and cream, which makes clogging virtually impossible. Seriously, Henson Shaving wants the best razor, not the best razor business. That means no plastic, no subscriptions, no proprietary blades, and no planned obsolescence. The Henson razor works with standard dual-edge blades to give you that old-school shave with the benefits of new-school tech. Once you own a Henson razor, it's only about $3 to $5 per year to replace the blades. My first shave with the Henson razor was incredibly refreshing. The design is sleek and the durability is top-notch. The Henson razor is so much better than your run-of-the-mill traditional razor brand. And the affordability factor is absolutely game-changing. No more wasting your money on expensive blades. With Henson Shaving, you can get a year of blades for $5. It's time to say no to subscriptions and yes to a razor that'll last you a lifetime. Visit hensonshaving.com/weekend to pick the razor for you and use code WEEKEND to get 2 years worth of blades free with your razor. Just make sure you add them to your cart. That's 100 free blades when you head to hensonshaving.com/weekend and use code WEEKEND. Maybe you're like me and you sometimes struggle with what to wear, finding pieces that go together and the hassle maybe of changing clothes for different activities. Well, Rhone's Commuter Collection is the most comfortable, breathable and flexible set of products. Commuter Collection offers the world's most comfortable clothes. You never have to worry about what to wear when you have the Rhone Commuter Collection. And with Rhone's wrinkle release technology, wrinkles disappear as you stretch and wear the products. With Gold Fusion anti-odor technology, you'll be smelling fresh and clean all day long. And on top of that, Rhone is 100% machine washable, so you can ditch the dry cleaner all together. I personally love feeling fresh. I love a technical fabric, and that makes me kind of confident knowing that the clothes are looking after themselves. Well, the Commuter Collection can get you through any workday and straight into whatever comes next. Head to rhone.com/weekendshow and use promo code weekendshow to save 20% off your entire order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to Rhone, RHONE.com/weekendshow and use code weekendshow. It's time to find your corner office comfort. We're back with Elie Honig on The Weekend Show. I'm Anthony Davis. Let's talk about William Barr. He is the former Attorney General under Donald Trump. He served as an AG previously, right? He was a Bush AG, so he had experience.
25 years apart. He was 91 to 93, and then he came back in 2018.
Right. So, I think Trump kind of brought him in to maybe look like the adult in the room. I don't know. That's certainly how he kind of painted himself. But he really was very much behaved like a personal lawyer for Donald Trump in a way, didn't he? He ran the Justice Department in a way that really you wouldn't suggest the word separation of powers. And maybe that's why a lot of the critics of Merrick Garland now think that Biden is running the Justice Department in the same way that Trump ran it with William Barr at the helm. The two couldn't really be further apart, could they?
I think they're completely opposite. And I think the criticism of Garland is really almost the opposite criticism of Barr. So I think the title of my book sort of states my thesis, which is Hatchet Man, How Bill Barr Broke the Prosecutor's Code and Corrupted the Justice Department. I have two fundamental critiques of Bill Barr. One is he's a liar, and I call him that in the book. And I'm very careful about that. To call someone a liar, L-I-A-R, is really a thing you try to avoid doing at all costs, both in the law and the media. You say, well, he misstated the facts, or he incorrectly, made the following assertion. But as I wrote this book, I found time and time again where he just lied to people's faces, to the face of Congress, to the media. And I can sort of talk about some of them. The other thing is he was a naked political partisan. As you said, he took the job to protect Donald Trump. And by the way, the reason Trump picked him, I argue in the book, and I think it's quite clear now, it's not because he thought Bill Barr would be an adult in the room. He didn't want an adult in the room. He wanted someone who was going to make the Mueller investigation go away. This is in 2018, right in the sort of height of the Mueller investigation. And what Bill Barr does, you may remember this, is a few months before that, it's entirely clear Trump's going to be getting rid of Jeff Sessions, who was the AG then. He's furious at Sessions. He doesn't think Sessions has kept enough control over.
And Sessions recused himself, and that really annoyed Trump, didn't it?
Annoyed, to say the least. Yeah, it infuriated Trump. And Bill Barr writes this unsolicited memo, which we call the audition memo, 19 or 20 pages, single-spaced, basically saying that Mueller's entire investigation is fatally misconceived. That's the quote. And then he sends it into Justice, and he tries, Barr, because, again, dishonestly later tries to say, oh, I wasn't trying to throw myself out there as an AG candidate. I was just offering my thoughts from a wise old head. I mean, give me a break. And then he tries to say, well, no, I didn't state a clear conclusion about the Mueller report. Really? Fatally misconceived? I mean, fatally as in dead, misconceived as in wrong. So Barr puts in this memo. Trump sees it. It was reported after my book. I theorized about this, but it ended up being true. Trump sees this audition memo and goes, aha, that's my guy. The one thing Trump wanted to do at that point was avoid the Mueller report. And sure enough, Bill Barr completely lies to the American public about what's in the Mueller report. And there's a really devious thing he does. I'm not sure if you remember this. Barr is the first person outside of Mueller's team to get the Mueller report. And Barr then issues a 4-page letter giving his own conclusions where he says there's no conspiracy and I find there's no obstruction.
It was like a paraphrased version, and he arranged a press conference the morning that the Mueller report was coming out. So you saw it looked official. The only person missing was Robert Mueller, because
and here's
it was
the thing.
unofficial.
In his letter, all he does is take all the good stuff for Trump and accentuate it, and take all the bad stuff for Trump and leave it out.
Yeah.
This is the point I was going to make. Bill Barr gives his bogus 4-page letter, and Trump and all his people declare victory, case over, no conspiracy, no collusion, no anything. And Mueller and his team are just completely defeated. And then what does Bill Barr do? Does he give us the report right away? Do you remember, Anthony, how long Bill Barr withholds the actual report from Congress and the American public? Do you remember how many?
It was redacted as well.
Right. Do you remember how long that was?
Tell me.
27 days. So for 27 days, all we had was Bill Barr's bogus 4-pager, not the report. And the reason Barr gave, which you said, was, well, we were redacting. Mueller had already redacted it.
Yeah.
And so he's controlling the narrative. He keeps the floor to himself for a month. And here's another, just while I'm on a tangent here, because I wrote this book a couple years ago, but this is what a liar Bill Barr is. A few days after Barr releases his 4-page letter, Bob Mueller writes a letter to Bill Barr. Mueller's this very sort of creature of DC, and he's very proper in everything he does. But for him to write a letter like this is a big deal. And he writes very politely, but he says, you have misstated the work and conclusions of my office, right? And so he tells Bill Barr, you've misstated what I've done. A few weeks later, again, the report's not out yet. Bill Barr goes in front of Congress, and I assume somebody must have tipped off one of the Democratic congressmen, but one of the Democratic members of Congress asks Bill Barr, basically, has anyone on Mueller's team expressed any dissatisfaction to you with the way you characterize the report? And Barr just leans right into the mic and goes, no. And, it was sort of passed. And then we see this letter from Mueller comes out, and it's like, what the heck? And then after the letter comes out, Barr goes in front of the Senate, and a senator says, you lied because my colleague in the House asked you if Mueller had ever expressed any dissatisfaction. You had received his letter, and you said no. And Barr goes, no, I don't think I lied. I didn't. He basically, it's a word salad, but it sounds like Barr is basically saying, well, he asked me if anyone on Mueller's team, and the letter came from Mueller, and I don't consider Mueller part of Mueller's team. I mean, this is what Bill Barr does. He changes one word in whatever you ask in a ridiculous way, and then he answers whatever he wants. So anyway, sorry for the tangent, but when I call the man a liar, this is why.
For those people who haven't read the Mueller report, and I'd say most people haven't, and that's the downside to a report that's that thick.
448 pages. I'm critical. I think it's too dense and too large for normal people to even begin to absorb.
Agreed. Yeah. But let's be clear what's in it, because I think people forget that it completely incriminated Donald Trump. And it basically said that the only reason he couldn't be charged is because he's the president. I mean, there was so much evidence in there, and yet most people seem to think that it was a bit of a damp squib.
So the big refrain for Trump in the wake of Bill Barr's summary was no collusion, no obstruction. Well, let's break that down. No collusion, meaning no collusion with Russia. Now, what Mueller actually found is the evidence here does not fit with any federal conspiracy crime. But, and this is what Barr leaves out, here's what Mueller did find. 1, Russia, including the Russian state, absolutely did interfere in the 2016 election. 2, they did it because they wanted to help Donald Trump and they wanted Donald Trump to win. 3, Trump's campaign knew that this was happening. 4, Trump's campaign welcomed it and expected the Russian interference. And 5, members of Trump's campaign tried to reach out to Russians to cultivate and foster this. So that's important to know. Was there a crime charged? No. Mueller concludes there was no conspiracy crime. He may be right, but let's reject this refrain of no collusion. Then no obstruction. That is not what Bob Mueller found. What Mueller found was, and I fault Mueller for being very wishy-washy on this. He lays out this overwhelming case of obstruction of justice, 11 different parts, 4 or 5 of which are meet all the legal elements of obstruction. And Mueller says, well, he's the sitting president, and we have longstanding DOJ policy, predates Trump, that says DOJ cannot indict the sitting president. And because of that, I'm not going to state any conclusion. And he gives us this, what I call Yoda speak, like Yoda in Star Wars. It's like this double negative, triple negative. If I could exonerate him, I would, but I can't. But if I would tell you, but I can't say, so I won't. And it's just this nonsense. And that, frankly, creates a void that Bill Barr eagerly jumps into. So Mueller tried to play sort of high and proper, and he didn't realize or he didn't care that he was dealing with a bunch of street brawlers in Trump and Barr who would do anything necessary. And as a result, his investigation amounted to nothing. Nobody was ever seriously investigated by Congress. It was a weak, lame, half-assed investigation. He was never impeached for anything he did. He was certainly never indicted for it. And so, Trump and his people, Barr, expertly spun this thing out of existence, and Mueller was too passive in allowing that to happen.
It's kind of further proof that justice is an ominous word in the United States.
Yeah.
It keeps lawyers in jobs and makes many of them very rich, but the frustration from regular people, just regular taxpayers, is significant, and that really is a problem.
Yep.
Bill Barr is kind of back on the TV talking circuit.
He sure is.
He has returned. Now let's not forget let's remind people exactly when he quit as Attorney General.
December 14th. Yes.
December 14th. So it was 2 weeks almost before the January 6th insurrection. And it's kind of now becoming clear that he knew that a coup was upcoming and he wanted no part of it.
So I've been very critical of Bill Barr for this. What Bill Barr likes to remind the world now that he's, doing his TV tour, which is extended for many months now. By the way, side note, Bill Barr always tried to put on this air of, I'm sort of an old grandfatherly figure. I came out of retirement to be AG. I don't have any interest in the PR or I don't care what people think of me. I'm too old for this job. Quite the contrary. He's on TV all the time.
He's a grifter.
Yeah, a bunch of his texts actually came out through a Freedom of Information request after he left office as AG, and he's like compulsively monitoring Twitter. Are people retweeting me? I mean, he's very image conscious. It's fine to be image conscious, but don't give us the whole grandfatherly, what do I care routine. Okay, that was a little bit of an aside. Bill Barr's calling card in his mind is that on December 1st of 2020, he publicly came out and said, we at DOJ have investigated and we've not found any substantial evidence of widespread election fraud. He did do that. And that was a blow against Trump. What Bill Barr wants us all to forget is that before that and before the election, he was one of the leading proponents, and he was fanning the flames of this fraud about this lie about the threat of election fraud. And I detail the instances. He went in front of Congress. He did an interview with NPR, National Public Radio. He did an interview with Wolf Blitzer at CNN. I'll just tell you a couple of quick things. He did an interview with NPR, and all of those times, this is in the lead up to the election, when Trump is starting to spread the lie. And Barr said, there's this massive threat of ballot fraud and tampering that we would be helpless to do anything about. It's a very dire situation. He's playing right into it as Attorney General. And it was bad enough that when he gave his interview to NPR, they had to run a correction shortly after where they quoted various experts who said that the things Barr was saying were, quote, crazy and nuts and totally false. And NPR had to write an article entitled, we allowed the Attorney General, I'm paraphrasing, we allowed the Attorney General of the United States to lie on our air. Then he went in front of my it's strange to call Wolf Blitzer a colleague, but because he's 20 levels above me, but a wonderful man who I deeply admire. But Wolf, a very senior colleague of mine, I will say, had Bill Barr on for an interview shortly before the election. And Bill Barr said, and Wolf pressed him. Wolf said, well, what examples do you have of massive election fraud? And Bill Barr said, it looked like for a moment Bill Barr had done his homework. He said, we have a case involving 1,700 fraudulent ballots in Texas. And I remember watching that thing like, well, that's actually pretty substantial. Turned out, A, it wasn't DOJ's case. B, it was a Texas state case that involved not 1,700 fraudulent ballots, but one fraudulent ballot. And it was so bad that DOJ had to issue a correction. They issued an official statement saying, and you know what they did? They did what all courageous leaders do. They blamed some anonymous underling. They said, somebody wrote a memo for the AG and he was given bad information, which is A, complete BS. And B, if you're a leader and you're going to go on CNN and be interviewed by Wolf Blitzer, and you have this really important talking point, you are going to say, whoa, we have a case involving 1,700? Get that? I want a briefing on this. I want to know what this is. This is great. Barr absolutely obfuscated on that and worse. And look, so did Bill Barr come out after the election, 3 weeks after the election, and say there was no evidence of fraud? Yup. And that's fine. That's part of the historical record, and we can give him credit for that as much as people think is due, or as little as people think is due. But let's not forget that he was one of the primary proponents. And the example I made is, it's like if he was at a campfire, lit the fire, fanned the flames, watched it catch on the trees and the cabins around him, and then took his beer and dumped it on and went, look, I helped. So that's sort of how I look at Bill Barr.
But there is no interest in prosecuting Bill Barr. I mean,
No.
The guy,
He'll never be prosecuted for anything.
Arguably broken the law. And that brings me to the Supreme Court, because, of course, now we're starting to hear some pretty, shady things going on. And Justice John Roberts, who leads the court, has been asked to talk to the Ethics Committee and potentially lead an investigation into Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch about, these dodgy cash gifts and buying of properties and selling of properties. And he shows no interest because he believes that there is a kind of self-regulation is satisfactory. This is another example of the elitist attitude of the wealthy and the powerful in America. How does this play out?
I'm very critical of the Supreme Court in my book and elsewhere. And, I've gone from sort of Supreme Court believer, when you come out of law school, you think these are the ultimate brilliant geniuses. These are the top of the profession, and they are to be listened to and respected and revered. Slowly over time, that wore away. And I think an important turning point was 2000 with the Bush-Gore election, when they completely all retreated to their partisan corners. Both sides happened to be 5 and 4. And both basically took the opposite of what their normal position is to make sure that the result was that their guy won. I think that really damaged the Supreme Court's standing in the view of a lot of Americans. And over the last 3 or 4 years, I have gone from Supreme Court believer to Supreme Court skeptic to Supreme Court cynic to now full-blown Supreme Court nihilist. I mean, they are the haughtiest of our haughty institutions. They are utterly unaccountable. They serve life terms. They're getting appointed younger and younger now. We're going to see Supreme Court justices who are doing 40, 50 years on the bench. There's zero accountability. There is a code of ethics that applies to every federal judge except the 9 Supreme Court justices. They're not bound by any code of ethics. They do whatever the heck they want. They respond to nobody. Just look at this Clarence Thomas. Turns out he's taking massive gifts from interested or semi-interested parties left and right. He's disclosing none of it. He's defiant. John Roberts, who's tried to make his whole goal, and he's completely failed, his whole goal has been to not have his era be the era where the court was sort of inextricably riven by ideological divide. He gets this request from Congress, and he very haughtily, oh, no, thank you. We shan't appear. And they just do what they want because they just wag their fingers at people, and they think that everyone has to listen to them. They blame the media. Alito is always out there blaming the media. And one thing I also point out in the book is, I primarily blame Thomas and Alito. I think they're probably the worst offenders in terms of accountability. But both sides have become 100% predictable based on result. The way you're taught in law school is it's like a math problem. You take your inputs and you do whatever the equation is, plus, minus, divide, and whatever comes out at the bottom line, that's your answer, like it or not. I now am entirely convinced it's quite the opposite. Everyone goes, how do I want this case to come out? And then you just backfill in the equation. And by the way, it's not that hard to do. If you want, and by the way, if you look at this mathematically, both sides have been remarkably predictable. How is it that we can always tell based on the result where everyone's going to come out? But the liberals have actually been even more predictable than the conservatives. Now they're a 6-3 minority right now, so they have no power to do anything. But if you want an area where the court has been in unanimity the last several years, and I write about this in the book, it's in gutting our public corruption laws. There have been several major cases out of the Supreme Court where the court has, and I won't go into all detail, but narrowed down the scope of public corruption laws. They threw out a conviction of the governor of Virginia. They threw out convictions relating to high-ranking people around the governor of New Jersey. And every time they chip away at our corruption laws, and those have been unanimous decisions. So if you want to be heartwarmed and you want to see the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg concurring with Alito, and if you want to see Sonia Sotomayor and Aleda Kagan on the same page as Neil Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas, look at these corruption decisions, because this is one area where the court has been in kumbaya unanimity.
Most other Western civilized democracies have Supreme Courts that are apolitical, non-political. And certainly in the UK, where I'm from, and our Justice Department or our justice system is held up around the world as being one of the most respected, we don't know the politics of any of the judges. The judges are able, we hope, to rule based on what is right and fair under the law. Do you ever think about the fact that, you know, you don't really have a Supreme Court or a High Court in America? You just have another bunch of politicians who are deciding, because it really is, there is no justice in the Supreme Court if it is to be political. And this whole game of packing the court and 6-3 or 4-3, or it's like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, it's illogical. It's nuts. It's insane. It's disrespectful to any case that is thrown before it, because it's political from the off. As a law student, and then as a lawyer and as a prosecutor, do you ever think about the fact that your system is so destructive for justice?
I do think about that with respect to the Supreme Court, and I've written about that. I wrote a piece recently where I said, I no longer view these justices as 9 judges of the law. I view them as 9 wannabe policymakers in black robes, unelected, life tenured policymakers in black robes. I think they've all gone that far off the rails. The conservatives have their dreamed of majority, supermajority, that they've been working on for decades. And so they're not going to give away this moment. The liberals are desperately clinging together because there's only 3 of them. And even if one of them disagrees with the liberal outcome, they're never going to part from that. And it's really destructive. And look, of course, a year ago or so, we had the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And, you know, there's this silly game that gets played with every Supreme Court nominee where they're asked, do you believe in precedent? And they say, of course I believe in precedent. Say, do you believe that Roe versus Wade is precedent? Do you believe that Brown versus Board of Education is precedent? And they go, of course it's precedent. And they go, and then the question always is, well, when would you overturn precedent? Because it's not necessarily forever, for all time. And then we just get into semantics of, well, only if and when, but they don't answer the question. And the answer, I know the answer. The answer to when the Supreme Court will overturn precedent is whenever the hell 5 justices feel like it. And they will give you the reason for it. It's not hard. This is what lawyers do. You get hired. If it's party A versus party B, and party A hires you, you make the argument for party A. Party B hires you, you make the argument for party B. They're brilliant, these justices. They have brilliant clerks. They can defend any bottom line. And increasingly, that's all they do. Now, people wonder sometimes what can be done. And I hate to sort of give this answer, but the answer is nothing. Theoretically, legally, we can expand the size of the court. That ain't happening. Joe Biden, for years, was opposed to that. He got himself in trouble because people started calling for it, and he hemmed and hawed. He did what everybody does when they want something to go away. He appointed a commission, which nobody even knows issued their report recommendations a year ago or something. And it was just a bunch of, well, we could do this. We're not doing it. The Supreme Court size is not going to expand. People say, well, how about term limits? We'd have to amend the Constitution because the Constitution provides for life tenure. And again, someone made this point to me that I think it was a viewer who just wrote in. It was a really good point. When the Constitution was ratified in 1789, life expectancy was like mid 40s. Now that number's depressed because infant mortality, but let's say 50 or 55 or something. Now it's, into the 80s. And so you are seeing both sides, and Republicans, of course, because they're always better at this, have been thinking strategically for longer than Democrats. And so now we're seeing 2 things that really give away the game. 1, strategically timed retirements. Why did Justice Kennedy retire while Trump was in office? They basically worked out a whole deal. Why did Justice Breyer hang on until Biden was in office? Because, people were furious at Ruth Bader Ginsburg that she didn't retire while Obama was in office. So you're seeing that. And then second of all, you're seeing you are not going to be considered if you're over the age of 55. It is just utterly impossible. Trump chose Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. They were all in their late 40s, early 50s when they were chosen. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is, I think, in her also lower 50s, because if one side is saying we're going to pick people who are going to be on the bench 30 to 40 years and the other side's picking 70-year-olds, you're going to end up with inherently with an imbalance. So again, it's more of the politicization of the Supreme Court, and I think it's been enormously damaging.
Why do you think there was no action to codify Roe into federal law after it was leaked, after the ruling was leaked that Roe v. Wade was going to be overturned? I mean, there was a gap, wasn't there, where politicians in Congress and in the Senate could have done something about it, and yet they didn't. Everyone was so excited about the fact that this leak had happened, was trying to decide who it was that had leaked it. They almost forgot to actually take action. Yeah.
So first of all, I think the answer is not enough political will, not enough political numbers. I mean, Democrats at the time controlled House, Senate, and White House, and they didn't get it done. Now, they would have needed a filibuster proof, 60 in the Senate, but they didn't do it. There were a lot of talk, and they didn't get it done. It's actually not quite clear that even if they had codified Roe, that it would have withstood, because then it would have that codification would have been challenged. It would have ended up right back at the Supreme Court. So, I'm not sure that there was ever any real way to do that. It's an interesting question as to who Roe versus Wade benefits, or Dobbs, which overturned Roe versus Wade, has benefited politically, because it certainly has motivated, it seems, if you look at the polling data, Democratic voters. And now we're seeing maybe another round of this with the recent ruling, although the Supreme Court actually put the brakes on this one, on the lower court rulings that would have limited access to, or eliminated access, at least temporarily, to abortion medication. So this remains a very live issue. And there was a part two to your question that I'm blanking on.
Well, for me, I'll change the question a little bit, because I want to move it on, and that is that this kind of political will is a big problem, isn't it? Because yes, we know in Congress and in the Senate we have the likes of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema who are preventing, or had prevented, a lot of this from moving.
Yeah.
But the fact that this is such an important issue. I mean, I was thinking about, I don't know if you saw this, I think I saw it on Instagram, a video of a baby, like a newborn baby drop-off hole in the wall in Kentucky for people, because abortion is banned, and so they have the baby that they don't want the baby, so they go to a hole in the wall and they put the baby in the thing and they leave anonymously, and then the baby is taken care of by the system, alerts the authorities, and then the baby's taken into social care.
Right.
I mean, if that's where we're at now as a result of inaction by politicians, or a failure to understand how, Roe might be an issue for evangelical Christians, but for the majority of the country, women specifically, they will be negatively affected, and it could cost them their lives.
Yeah, and we're now in this really, I'll say suboptimal scenario where the laws are different by every state. You can have a state that's surrounded by states that do not allow abortion, and your state might allow abortion, and people are having to cross state lines. And we're seeing states pass laws that are trying to reach across their state borders and make it a crime to go to another state, or to cross a state line, or to order medication or into a state. And so this whole issue remains very much alive, very much unsettled, to the point where we just have complete lack of uniformity. You cross over a state line and what you can and cannot do will completely change. And so we've been thrown into a maybe temporary, I hope temporary, state of legal chaos. And another question that I have is, what happens someday, and it will happen someday, we don't know if it'll be 5 years from now or 75 years from now, but what happens someday when a Democratic majority again sort of is in charge in the Supreme Court? Are we going to get into yo-yo territory where it just goes back and forth and back? I mean, I say that half sarcastically, but halfway I can see it, given the way everyone's ruling. Like, what if just by some fluke, what if let's just not have any morbid scenarios where people are passing away, but what if a law was passed and they decided we're going to expand the Supreme Court to 15, and Joe Biden managed to get through 6 more Democrats, and it became 9-6 Democrats? Don't you think? I think they would immediately reinstate Roe v. Wade, right? I mean, it's a counterfactual. We're engaged in hypothesizing here, but I think they would absolutely do that. And then if I mean, the fact that we maybe are going to be sort of yo-yoing these policies back and forth just based on who's in control, I think tells you everything you need to know about the court. There's no principle. It's all policy. It's all outcome based.
Finally, let's talk about the whitest man in America, Mike Pence.
I wasn't sure who you were going to give that title to. Okay.
Well, I think it's a fitting title, not just for his hair.
The hair is very white. Yeah.
But also for his political views as well. He now is a kind of a bit of a linchpin in this case with with Trump, obviously, and Trump was trying to block him from giving testimony, and now that has been, in the last kind of few days, that has now been overturned, and so and Trump and Pence is not going to appeal this. He's right. Finally going to give the testimony, and this could be a big problem for Donald Trump. Finally, let's just kind of look at what this means and how this kind of takes the case forward.
So what this means in the most tangible terms is Mike Pence, the former vice president of the United States, will be testifying under oath in front of a grand jury in a criminal investigation against his own former president, Donald Trump. I mean, that, I don't think I need to embellish that. That is...
And no executive privilege, which was the argument that Trump was pushing.
Right. And I have actually a chapter in the new book, in Untouchable, about executive privilege and about how throughout it's existed throughout our history. It's had sort of different names attached to it. But, name your favorite president. He's probably invoked some variation of it, from Obama to Bush to Thomas Jefferson and John F. Kennedy and many others. But up until now, it has been something that presidents have deployed very selectively, carefully, and with mixed results. Donald Trump comes on the scene and completely blows it out. There was actually a moment where Donald Trump walked out of the White House and into the yard, into the lawn out there to get on a helicopter or something. And he said, "We're fighting all the subpoenas." Now, if you heard that, you probably thought, oh, he's just being Donald Trump. He's being hyperbolic. Oh, no, he meant it. Every single subpoena to anyone around him. He's argued executive privilege, which is basically the idea that legitimate internal conversations about policy or strategy within the executive branch should be protected. But of course, the courts have said over the years, including in the Nixon case, yeah, but that doesn't mean you get to hide evidence of criminality. And Trump has gone to court and maybe lost every single one of these cases. I'm not sure. I can't remember if he ever eked out one half win or another, but he has lost over and over and over again. And on the one hand, you think, okay, he lost, he deserved to lose. But on the other hand, I argue in the book, it has helped him to dodge justice, because what has he managed to do by challenging every single case all the way? Delay. The January 6th investigation, criminal investigations, and some of these cases, we've actually gotten better. For a while, our courts were taking years. Don McGahn, who was a White House lawyer, his executive privilege case took 2 years in the courts, and it wasn't even resolved. Finally, McGahn just settled it on his own. The courts have actually gotten quite a bit better. They're actually now deciding these cases much quicker. I used to rant about this, like, hey, judges, you can do whatever case you want first. So if there's a case that involves the separation of powers and the balance of powers, how about you move that, above the auto collision case, right? So courts have got much better, but Trump has managed to drag these investigations out entirely to his own benefit, because he has used and abused executive privilege. I should go back and try to figure out his actual won-loss record on executive privilege. I think it's something like, probably, I would guess 0-25 or something. But hey, he's helped us flesh out this sort of mysterious area of law. So I'll give him that.
Mike Pence is trying to play the role of national hero, simply because he did his job on the 6th of January by certifying the correct electors rather than these fake electors that were sent through from the legislatures. Right. So he just did his job. The vice president role is kind of ceremonial, but that's kind of part of it. But Trump really was hanging this kind of last chapter of this coup on Mike Pence flipping, and it didn't happen. Do you think that Mike Pence has got more to say to a grand jury, or do you think that Pence is really going to just say as little as possible to get through this process?
I suspect he'll be an important witness, but I suspect prosecutors may end up a bit disappointed by his testimony, because if you look at Mike Pence's public statements, he's trying to have it both ways. Yes, he wants credit for refusing to steal an election, but he also has refused to come out and just roundly condemn Trump, and everything's like, well, he and I don't agree on what happened that day. We don't see eye to eye, I think was his phrase. And he wants to, remember, Mike Pence is probably going to run for president, and everyone understands that you're not going to win the Republican primary if you completely lose Donald Trump's base, which is however many percent of the Republican voters, 40, 70, who knows what it is, but it's a huge, huge chunk of them. And so I think he's going to try to have it both ways, but his testimony should be vital, because now prosecutors get to ask him about, what did Donald Trump say to you one-on-one? Did he acknowledge that he lost? Did he ask you to do anything? I mean, we know what he asked Pence to do, but did you tell him this is illegal? What did he say? Did he say, I don't care? That should be vital testimony. Just knowing what we know of Mike Pence, seeing what we've seen of him, I don't have a lot of faith that he's going to come out and truthfully spill his guts. I think he's going to try to walk a very fine tightrope.
Okay. We have to finish, but I'm very grateful to you. Elie Honig, thank you for joining.
Thank you, Anthony. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm Anthony Davis. Please subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast. And don't forget to support me on Patreon at patreon.com/5Minute News. My daily podcast drops every morning. You can hear me tell you what's happening in America and around the world while you drink your morning coffee. And join me next week with a brand new special guest and more factual news stories to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.